these decisions on agriculture, these have absolutely nothing in terms of substance. That's why I said, it was just a kind of ministerial declaration without any substance. But well, they came out of the outcome, so one has to accept it, accept as it is. But the more important aspect of the ministerial conference is that the bigger issues on agriculture and which India is faced with, they actually they're not discussed at all. They forget about being mentioned in any of these outcome documents. They're not discussed at all. And the most important of this, of which is, the public stock holding for food security purposes, which is, is a kind of hanging fire from 2013 from the Bali Ministerial Conference. We're expecting a kind of a permanent solution. But of course, the big powers wouldn't have anything of that. They I think want to keep us under pressure, under this kind of the Damocles sword hanging on our head, and this is done with good purpose. And Shuklaji was witness to it, in the CAT negotiations. That all these pressure points were created in order to extract substantial, concessions on something else. And as you, Shalini, was mentioning, that the whole canvas of the WTO, the remit of the WTO is actually expanding, and there is a huge push for expansion. And India is standing out there. One of the good things I think India has been doing in the past few years is preventing this expansion of the GATT, which is happening quite outside the multilateral space. And I'll if I have time, I just mention that. But let me talk about the public stockholding issue, and most of you participants know about the core problem. And this really stems from the whole subsidies regime that was defined in the Agreement on Agriculture. Now, for a long time, people in the government of India really thought that the subsidies really were related to production subsidies. There was nothing to do with food subsidies. Little did these people realize in the government that there's an annex in which defined all the green box subsidies. There was an annex relating to this public stock holding, where this whole mischief was done. It was that countries like India, which undertake the food security programs, using a publicly held, food stocks like we do, in the sense that the government procures these grains from the farmers, creates the food stock, and then distributes out of this food stock. Now, there, the quote unquote discipline is that the buying and the selling of these food grains would take place without any subsidy. So whatever price the government buys those grains will have to be the grains have to be sold at the same price, which means that there can't be any subsidies. And if there is a gap between these two prices, then the administered price, the price at which the government buys the food grains, will be compared with a fixed external reference price, which is the 1986-88 price. And the difference will be taken. The amount of food distributed, or the amount of food distributed through the PDS, will then be taken, and the total of this will be added to the subsidies bill. So you can imagine. So on the one hand, we have the production subsidies, production related subsidies, which are subsidies for the MSP, the market price support. Then we have the input subsidies. And again, the market price support is measured the same way as I mentioned. The current administered price is compared with the 1986-88 price of a 3.5-decade-old price, and then the extent of subsidies is calculated. So if you can very well understand that India is actually reaching has in some crops, like for instance rice, and there is a threshold that you can't give subsidies more than 10% of the value of production. Now, India has already crossed that in case of rice. In case of rice, it's already about 15% of the value of production. Now, if you compare today's price with 35-year-old price, then of course you're going to get this kind of distortions. So there is this thing hanging that we can't continue providing or running the PDS system if the total of production subsidies and food subsidies exceed 10% of the value of production. Now that is actually happening. We actually exceeded the 10% limit. So in 2013 there was a decision saying that okay, it's something called the peace clause. That okay, India, if India this subsidies exceed 10%, no one is going to take India to a dispute until the time we are going to have a permanent solution to this problem. So the permanent solution was offered, but in the WTO we know that there is no free lunch. This was given to us. The condition imposed was that nothing from the food stocks can be exported. Now here comes the problem. Till such time when the government of India hadn't actually gone on this whole thing of being an agricultural exporter, there wasn't any problem. But in the last 3 years, the rate at which exports have increased, and exports have increased, and earlier, other important thing was that our exports of rice was largely exports of basmati rice. Yeah? Non-basmati rice wasn't actually the big thing. But in the last 3-4 years, non-basmati rice exports have actually exceeded basmati rice. That's point number one. And the other thing is that we were only a marginal exporter, sometimes importer of wheat. Now we are a major exporter of wheat. So these two things have actually, have caught the attention of these the big players, and we are really under the hammer now. On these Committee on Agriculture meetings, in every meeting, the questions are being asked, and we have been put under tremendous pressure. But so the thing is that if the permanent solution was found, if this and what did India say was a way out? Was India said that this 86-88 base year should either be brought forward to a more recent period, or the inflation that has taken place since 86-88 and now, and which I did actually some calculation, is 900% inflation is there between 86-88 and 2021. 900% inflation. Now that inflation must be written into these the calculation. Now, unless this happens, this is completely bereft. Now, this is something that all of us need to understand, and I think we need to agitate much more than what we have done already. That this completely illogical kind of approach to agricultural subsidies can't go on, because this is going to hit us, our agriculture, very hard. Very soon we'll not be able to, again under the WTO, we'll not be able to give subsidies or give MSP to most of the crops which are being provided MSP now. Now, like I said, in the Committee on Agriculture, there's been this pressure. On 1st of July, a dozen US congressmen, and I checked their background, all of these are representing the farm lobby. They have written a letter to President Biden saying that India's, India is actually giving subsidies much more than it should, and India should be taken to the cleaners in the sense that there should be a dispute against India. So, quite in addition to what Shalini mentioned about the sugar dispute, there is a serious possibility of disputes being raised in case of wheat and rice subsidies. Now, all this would have been taken care of. I'll just take 2-3 minutes more, Shalini. All these issues would have been taken care of if there was seriousness about concluding the Doha round of negotiations. Now, Doha round of negotiations was launched in the backdrop of this extremely unequal treat that agreement on agriculture is. And, developing countries got together, coalition of developing countries got together and forced the WTO for once to take this decision that a new round of negotiations will be initiated, and the new round of negotiations will be anchored on the development concerns of developing countries. And one of the major items on the agenda was reforming the agreement on agriculture and making it more balanced. And again, the centerpiece of that reform agenda on agriculture was the subsidies regime. Now, the Doha negotiation started in 2000. Doha round started in 2002, and it went up to the financial crisis of 2008. And after that, everything sort of ended there. Many developing countries, India included, tried to raise this issue of reviving the Doha round, but it didn't. And in the 11th Ministerial Conference in Buenos Aires, there was no ministerial declaration there because the Ministerial Conference ended in a failure. The chair of the conference, the Argentine commerce minister, trade minister, said that and I'm just quoting from his statement, there remain differences of opinion on the Doha round and the Doha development agenda. So there was no unanimity on this. And you fast forward to MC12 and all the outcome documents and all the discussions, not a word was mentioned on the Doha development agenda. So Doha round is effectively dead and buried. And all the possibilities that we had to reform the extremely egregious subsidies regime, now that stands null and void. I think it is all these efforts we'll see no kind of outcome. So my short point at the end of the ministerial conference is that there have been a lot of, in the press, many of you would have read that the ministerial conference was a great success. And after what I've actually painted in front of you, the picture that I painted in front of you, I think you make it out for yourself whether it was a success or failure, because the most important item on the agenda was agriculture, and agriculture was not discussed. And agriculture, the WTO agriculture regime has left Indian agriculture facing a very serious threat of action by all the advanced countries. So I think we need to put our heads together and force the government to really move on this issue and to ensure that the farmers in India are not deprived of their rightful, of their rights, something for which they negotiate or they agitated for one whole year on the MSP. That MSP is under a serious threat. And I think, we need to really put our heads together and do something going forward.
Quick analysis and information about the MC12 outcomes. And I'm very glad that Professor Dhar went before me because I knew he would pick on the key issues, which is, of course, the permanent solution on public food stockholding, and discuss that in detail. So let me take you through maybe just a quick overview of what the outcomes mean. I mean, just like a quick analysis. And I mean, in fact, I will speak less about the political dynamics of the Indian engagement, because I know Shuklaji and Professor Dhar are more than enough to kind of actually handle that. Let me quickly just take you through some of the outcomes. So as Shalini already mentioned, this ministerial is a key ministerial for agriculture and food security related issues, right? Following the pandemic and then the food crisis because of the war, we know that many developing countries and LDCs are at a crisis point in terms of their food security. And the WTO had been promising and making, a lot of noise before the ministerial to really deliver these great outcomes. But what do we have? So basically, there were 3 tracks leading up to the ministerial. One is an agriculture decision, which is the work program. Every year we have such a decision, which generally kind of lays out, what were agreed and what is to be done, what will be the modalities for that, and so on. Second thing, this time they discussed an emergency response to food insecurity. This was in response to the current food crisis. And the third is a decision on the World Food Program. This was a decision not to restrict exports for purchase by the World Food Program, because the World Food Program said that, they are finding it difficult because countries are putting up restrictions on exports during these crisis situations, and therefore they are not able to procure for their humanitarian work. So that was the third decision. I think the first one, which already Professor Dhar referred to, is what was not agreed, right? And which was the key thing. This is a work program on agriculture. So this contained kind of, in the lead up to the ministerial, it included a lot of these issues which were being discussed in the ministerial. And as Professor Dhar already told you, the biggest one and the most important one for developing countries, a critical one for India, was the permanent solution on public stockholding. As Professor Dhar said, we have a kind of interim peace clause from Bali, which says that countries, if they abide by certain conditions, then even if they are giving more than 10% subsidy, which is the allowed limit under WTO rules, for our MSP, on market price administered price support for public food programs, right? Which mainly developing countries use. These public food program, we know our PDS has been a critical tool during the pandemic, even during food crisis. It's a very important policy instrument for developing countries and LDCs. Rich countries don't really need to use it much, but this subsidy we know has been challenged in the WTO, and we had an interim decision. But the problem is the interim decision that says countries can give, in excess of this 10% limit, to farmers as price support, but it had vague conditions. It had very difficult conditions, but I think the main problem is the conditions are vague. Nobody really knows how to meet them, because it just says you should not distort trade, you should not adversely affect food security of other countries. What does that mean? Does it mean you should not export, or does it mean that, even in your own country, US should be free to import into India? And if they cannot, then also that is seen as trade distortion. So since it's kind of not clear, it is actually very difficult to meet. And as Professor Dhar rightly said, India has been facing these disputes at the WTO, and twice it had, no, actually 3 times, it has filed in the WTO, it had tried to use this interim decision. It's called the Bali Peace Clause. And each time India has faced massive questions. Developed countries have been saying you do not meet the conditions, and India is frankly on the verge of being taken to dispute settlement in spite of there being this peace clause. So the peace clause is obviously not effective enough, not user-friendly enough. It's been riddled with vague conditionalities, precisely with the purpose that countries should not be able to use it. So this time, a permanent solution, as Professor Dhar said, is due. We should have got it in 2017. And this time, leading up to the ministerial, the African group submitted, this is a group of, I think, 44 African countries. They submitted a proposal in 2021. The G33 group of developing countries submitted a proposal in 2021. Then just before the ministerial, about 80 countries, the African group, G33, and the African and Caribbean Pacific group, ACP group, together they submitted a very strong and powerful joint proposal. But the developed countries refused to listen. So this was highly due in MC12, right? This should have been the big outcome on agriculture in MC12. We have seen through the pandemic how we need this, our public food programs to run properly. And for that, supporting farmers with an administered price and subsidies is critical. But we do not have that policy tool under the AOA. And at the same time, we see developed countries giving huge subsidies under different, baskets and boxes, etc. And they're getting away with it. This time, even with all these proposals, a lot of fight from developing countries, it was not given. And as I said, because we do not have an agreed work program on agriculture, we do not actually have another deadline. But the good thing is there is the Nairobi ministerial decision. Nairobi ministerial was in 2015. It actually says that this should be negotiated and agreed. So even if it's not agreed now, negotiations will continue. But as Professor Dhar said, this needs huge work from governments and from all of us. If we as civil society do not continue to push on this issue, to work with our governments, to push our governments, and to push northern governments, we are never going to get this. The other two important issues for developing countries, you will see on the slide, number 2 and 3, are one is a special safeguard mechanism, SSM. This allows us to increase import duties when there's a sudden increase in imports, right? This has been a major problem for India and other developing countries. This is called a situation of import surge. Developing countries have been fighting to get some protection. They want to simply to be able to raise duties when they are faced with an import surge. The rich countries are refusing to give. This has a mandate, but no, again, they didn't give. Another issue is cotton. There are many issues related to cotton, but frankly, US, EU, these countries give huge cotton, domestic subsidies on cotton. This has hurt producers in India, producers in key African cotton producing countries. Now they have reduced export subsidies, but they still have huge domestic subsidies and they refuse to discuss. The other issue is domestic support. So, all of you know, it's fabled, right? That Western countries have continued to give huge agricultural subsidies. And developing countries have been telling them, you cannot do this. They enjoy, extra entitlements. They use green box support. They subsidize in all kinds of ways. So developing countries for a long time have been saying this needs to be cut. You need to discipline your subsidies. But now we are seeing over the last 1.5, 2 years that this whole discussion has been twisted in a way that is very damaging for developing countries, including India. So the formula that are now being proposed means even developing countries will have to give up critical, special and differential treatment. Because we are developing countries, we get certain concessions, we get certain preferential treatment, but this new formula being proposed is saying nothing doing. Developing countries don't get special concession anymore. Everybody has to cut. And actually, if that kind of formula went through, developing countries and LDCs will actually have to cut their duties and their subsidies, much more than rich countries, frankly. So this whole discussion is also being kind of turned in an absolutely bizarre way. But the damage is, there are issues against our interest, which is on market access, that is more liberalization. We should remove import duties and open up our markets. Second is export restrictions. This is a highly political issue that's coming up that we really need to watch. That rich countries, you remember last year, the EU put up restrictions on export of COVID vaccines. The US had put up restrictions on exports of raw material for vaccines. But they are now turning around and telling us, developing countries, that even in a situation of food crisis, we should not put up export restrictions. Now, the WTO says we should not put up export restrictions except in a situation of food crisis, but it recognizes that in a situation of food crisis, countries may need to put up temporary export restrictions. You know, India put up wheat export restrictions and so on. So it's a very complex issue, but developed countries have been pushing to remove all disciplines on, all export restrictions. They are also pushing for higher transparency. And I think the reason this work program did not go through is because the US started saying that if you have, like a strong deadline for the 13th Ministerial Conference for PSH and SSM and cotton, then we will have same deadlines for market access, export restrictions, and transparency, which means if in MC13, which is just 1.5 years down the line, it's in December next year, if we had said, okay, now give us the permanent solution on public stockholding, they would say, oh, market access, export restrictions, these have the same deadline. So I've spoken to many negotiators. Frankly, they feel it's good that this decision was not agreed, because then they would have had to agree to all these very, very, bad issues. Quickly, Shalini, how much time do I have left? Quickly, the two other decisions. One is the decision on food insecurity. This is supposed to give developing countries, net food importing developing countries, and LDCs, the tool to deal with food crisis. But what do they need to do? They actually need to increase production and productivity, right? Like we all realize, the global market is dominated by only a few agribusiness companies and a few countries. I have analyzed the market for each agriculture product, major product. Only 3-4 countries dominate entire export market. And we do not want concentration in the global market, because it's very, very damaging, even for consumers. So all through, when developing countries said that, that they want that their ability to produce, their ability to increase production and productivity, they were continuously told by the DG and the rich countries, no need to increase production, no need to increase productivity. We will sell you everything. Just liberalize trade. Just keep markets open. Do not put up restrictions. Remove your import duties. We will sell you everything. So this was actually a major battle in this food security declaration, because they did not want to include any language on increasing production and productivity. But the other thing was, one gain I would say we have made in para 8 is NFIDCs, which are countries like Egypt, Sri Lanka, who are dependent on food imports, and LDCs. They now have a dedicated work program for addressing their food security issues. So already it's facing a challenge. They managed to fight. They really fought. Actually, Egypt and Sri Lanka fought for this, and they got a dedicated work program. But it's already, under threat. They are being told, oh, let's merge it with other processes, etc. How do they operationalize it will remain critical. And I think the other thing is, what they're trying to push is, they're trying to remove all reference to the Doha development round, right? Remember, now we did not like the Doha development round. It had many problems, but the fact is it was still better than what is happening today. So what they are saying is, let's forget Doha. The US already said after MC12 that let's forget Doha round, let's forget Buenos Aires, Bali decision, which gives us the mandate for the public stockholding outcome. Let's forget Nairobi. We will move on new ground, basically, right? So what they want to do is, they want to delete all commitments made to developing countries, including India, and they just want issues of interest to them. I think the big push is for export restrictions, that we should not put up export restriction. And we know there is a big interest, EU, US, they want access to developing country raw material. Even in the free trade agreements, they do not want us to have export taxes, because they want that their mining companies should come in, mine, and they should be free to export raw material. They want to, and they have clearly said it. EU has a raw material initiative. They have said that, we want to access raw material from India and other developing countries. So I think this whole export restriction thing is very political. We need to watch it. The other issue is sustainability, sustainable agriculture and food system. We would like our agriculture to be sustainable, but this term is actually being hijacked, in the name of sustainability. And in fact, EU is pushing this even in the free trade agreements. including in the India-EU Free Trade Agreement. And in the name of sustainability, they actually want to push massive privatization of the agriculture sector. And they have been pushing it in the WTO also. The WFP thing, it's too little. It will not solve global food security. I do not have time to discuss this. So let me move on. The developed countries very cleverly use some strategies. They hijack the narrative. When you are talking about food crisis, which is a big important issue in developing countries, LDCs, in foods which are in countries which are import dependent, but it's the developed countries which jumped in and tabled the first proposal. And therefore they hijack the narrative. They are the ones who are giving the recommendations. And the recommendation always is, you do not need to increase production, do not increase productivity, just open trade. So they use the pandemic, they've used the food crisis to push that one narrative, which is of interest to their agribusiness, which is to simply push for liberalization of agricultural markets in India and across developing countries and LDCs. They have extensively used green rooms, which, you know, only a few countries can join. They just call a 2-3 ally countries or 2-3 developing countries. Most countries did not get any agriculture text even till first week of June. And the ministerial was 12th to 15th. They want to eliminate reference to Doha, etc., etc. So finally, we have a lot of work to do. We need to do research analysis. We need to track the negotiations. We need to revive, build and strengthen our campaign. It's critical because we need to engage with national governments. You know, in the WTO level, so much politics is being played. A lot of pressure on many developing countries not to push with the permanent solution. So we need to engage with our governments and if definitely the Indian government that they need to carry on the fight. And we need to also give technical inputs to negotiators. They are actually asking for technical inputs, you know. So on PSH, SSM, cotton, domestic support. So issues of interest to us, we need to watch, but also issues which are against the interest of developing countries. I told you, I think those also, we really need to engage. We need to understand. We have a lot of work to do.